Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I was just saying you're in the session of the conference. This is such an important topic. My name's Audrey Vernick. I'm the Director of Patient and Family Advocacy for the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance. I have probably emailed you or talked to you on the phone, or maybe you've seen me in a webinar. I'm really happy to meet you all in person, and I'm running around a bit this weekend, but if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at any time. And I'm really, really thrilled to introduce our speakers today. So first we have Anya Maloney, and she's a speech-language pathologist and literacy specialist at the Mass General MGH, Institute of Health Professions, with training in the development and disorders of spoken and written language. Her clinical experience spans working in various settings, including schools, outpatient hospital clinics, and private practice, with school-age children ranging in age from preschool through college. And then Dr. Christodoulou is an associate professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders and the director of the BEAM Lab, or Brain, Education, and Mind, in the Center for Health and Rehabilitation. Okay, this is really hard to do on 5 hours of sleep, people. At the MGH Institute of Health Professions. Her lab conducts research on the brain behavior links underlying reading development and difficulties, and their link to academic skills, including math and attention. Dr. Christodoulou sits on the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance's Scientific Advisory Board, thank you. And in collaboration with the Alliance, she's published several research papers to help us understand literacy after hemispheric surgery. And you probably know her team is conducting research this weekend and has been doing so for the past 5 years, I believe. And we're really honored to have you. So welcome to both Anya and Joanna, and take it away. Sorry about the fumble.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Boston. I'm so happy to share the city with you, and I know it's just a special time to share in any city, so thank you for being here. Hopefully you get to enjoy the city while you're here, and part of the enjoyment is just sharing the time together. So we're interested in sharing with you the story of reading in the context of hemispherectomy. Some of you have already been a part of our research efforts. We're having people visit us at MIT for some brain scans and doing some assessments virtually. If you have any questions about that study that's ongoing or would like to learn more, please find us and reach out anytime. Our main agenda, though, is to really share with you what do we know about reading after hemispherectomy and how can we support students, especially at home. So we'd like you to leave today with some very concrete tools to support reading and give you some understanding around what it is that we support both at home and in the classroom. When we think about the continuum of recovery, the one that I have bolded in purple here is environment. I want to emphasize that while some things are not able to be changed, like the nature of the injury or where somebody is in their development, we can change environments. And the home environment is the one that we have the most control over. So I want you to know and be empowered with the idea that home literacy settings are one of the most predictive features of a reader's outcomes. We can do a lot in the home setting to foster skills. So that just puts a lot of agency in our hands, and we want to give you the tools to fulfill that. I'm going to talk a little bit about where the research is. We have a long way to go in advancing research in reading, but there are some headlines I wanted to put in your hands. One of the headlines, well, three of them I'll summarize here. I'll be very headliney so we can really get to the action items. One headline is, when individuals experience their brain injury earlier, their outcomes tend to be better. All of this is a story on average, and there's always variability. But I'm just kind of sharing what kinds of headlines have been put into research so far. Another, which is sort of related, those who have had surgery later tend to have more difficulty acquiring their reading skills. But the most predictive feature from the clinical side around reading outcomes is how short the time is between seizure onset and surgery. So the less time that an individual has the seizure experience, the more positive their reading scores, the higher their reading scores tend to be. So this is some of the insight coming out of the research on the reading side as it relates to clinical predictors. We have so much more to learn around etiology and age and surgical procedures and so forth, but this gives us a start. Another story to tell is what we know by hemisphere. For most readers, they rely on their left hemisphere for reading. the research has the headline that a right hemisphere is sufficient for literacy. So having the non-dominant hemisphere for language being the one that's relied on now for reading and language has opportunity, has potential, and that's all that we're here to fulfill. On average, what do reading scores look like? If you have a remaining left hemisphere, you tend to be about 1 standard deviation below average, and we're comparing this to a normative sample. And if you tend to have a right hemisphere remaining, your outcomes are not as strong, but they're not that far below where they are for peers with the remaining left hemisphere. All that's to say that when we think about the reading outcomes for students, for readers post-hemispherectomy, the variability is the defining story. Averages are not that helpful. So I just invite you to take stock of all the circumstances and all the features of individuals in your homes or lives that have been impacted by hemispherectomy, and just get situated with these average stories as we try to understand more about it. And one additional insight is when we think about what else predicts reading and math skills post-hemispherectomy, one of the skills that we've honed in on is working memory. That's a fancy word just to say, can I take information in and hold on to it and think about it in real time and make it useful to myself? A student's capacity to do that. So for example, I might say, hey, can you remember this phone number while I go run to the phone to dial it? And they hold on to it and they think about it. The strength of that skill essentially serves as it serves as a channel through which information comes into the brain, stays there, and that's through which learning happens. So what's one thing we're learning about? If a child has working memory that's available and the longer their capacity is for holding on to information, the stronger it is for the learning side. Those are some of the research findings. Now let's get to some of the principles that are taken from struggling readers, mostly from the developmental context, students who have dyslexia, which are our template, because so much work has been done on struggling readers from that perspective. So I'm going to share with you 3 principles that underlie impactful reading opportunities for students trying to learn how to read better. Is that a fire alarm?
Attention, please. The signal tone you have just heard indicated a report of an emergency in this building. If your floor evacuation signal sounds after this message, walk to the nearest stairway and leave the floor. While the report is being verified, occupants on other floors should await further instructions. Attention, please. The signal tone you have just heard indicated a report of an emergency in this building. If your floor evacuation signal sounds after this message, walk to the nearest stairway and leave the floor. While the report is being verified, occupants on other floors should await further instructions. Attention, please. The signal tone you have just heard indicated a report of an emergency in this building. If your floor evacuation signal sounds after this message, walk to the nearest stairway and leave the floor. While the report is being verified, occupants on other floors should await further instructions.
I guess I'll invite you to do what feels safest for you. And it sounds like we don't have a warning signal for us.
They're checking if someone's going to tell us if we need to evacuate, but they just turned away and said it's not on. So we're hoping, fingers crossed, but if you want to evacuate, you may, but we're not being asked to right now. Someone's going to come in. Will they let us know? Yes, yes. There's security at kids, there's security here. So I would just keep rolling and I will be on the call.
I think of all crowds who have learned how to roll with it, this is maybe the most expert group at that skill set. So the world keep rolling. And now just getting to the good stuff. So I'm really happy I can keep going on that front. We're going to review 3 guiding principles for impactful reading instruction, and then we're going to give you specific things you can do in home settings and give you some classroom accommodations. When we think about teaching kids to read who are vulnerable in that experience, 3 specific things to think about. We want instruction to be explicit. That means we don't ever want to assume something that seems obvious to us is something that's obvious to someone else. I'll give examples of each of these, but I'll just walk through each one. So the theme of explicit instruction is one of the absolute keys. Never make any assumption, even if you taught it yesterday, even if they did their homework on it. Any experience a child has had with learning, there should not be assumption that that learning is owned and complete just because of exposure. It might take multiple exposures. Yeah. Focus. Okay. We want instruction to be systematic. That means we need it to be layered in and have examples shown and give steps that give a child a way to complete their tasks without being overwhelmed with the entirety of it. And we want to give them feedback in real time. So if something's going on that's not correct, we want them to know and give them feedback about what needs to be rerouted. So let's give some examples. Here's an example of a lesson that is less explicit, and I will follow up with one that is more explicit. Let's say there's an example where we have a lesson where telling students that we tell students that asking questions about something they read during and after reading will help them check their understanding of what they read. Then we would tell students that they will read a passage and generate questions. Then we will have students read the first section. We will ask each one to write a question that could be answered by reading the passage, and then we will have students share their questions. So if this is what we plan to do, we can ramp this up to be more explicit. Here's how. In addition to the first 2 steps, we want to show them with a model exactly what it would look like to make questions. We want to show them, we can, like it says here, we model creating a question that can be answered using the information found right there in the passage. We want to give them a think aloud. Think alouds are a way to showcase cognitive apprenticeship. That means that we want to take what it means to think and make the process obvious and explicit. I think about things in these ways. I'm not just showing you the conclusion of my thinking, but the process of it as well. So reading instruction that is more explicit, that includes models and even scripts. When I think about that, here's how I talk myself through it. I give myself examples of the scripts that first somebody else teaches you, and then eventually the individual owns for themselves. So we want to give people the words that guide their thinking, the actions that guide their thinking, and the steps to get through all of those pieces. Okay, another theme is to make instruction more systematic. Systematic means, here's an example of something that's less systematic. We might have, finally we're saying math. Math never gets much attention, so I'm acknowledging that math is as important as reading with even less research. So noting that, here's a short example. Let's say the plan was to tell students that they will learn to measure things to the nearest inch. We give them a ruler. We tell them that if they're measuring something that ends between 2 numbers, they use the closest number, etc. I'll just pivot to the more systematic example. More systematic means you're going to give the kids the tools, you're going to provide instruction with the prerequisite skills needed to measure to each inch, and you're going to fill in the blanks so that there's no part of the instruction that they have to wonder, how do I do that? Or how do I achieve that? So you're giving everything explicitness, you're giving things directions, you're giving verbal scripts for achieving outcomes. And the third theme is the response and feedback. So I'll just actually show you the example that has more response and feedback. So we want to be able to incorporate goal setting and monitoring. As I'm going through an activity, I don't want to wait to the very end to see if an individual was on task. I want to be able to say, as you're going through something, how's it going? And if they can't do that for themselves yet, then their learning partner does that for them, which could be those in the home setting or in the school setting. So we want to be able to support kids during the process of learning, not waiting for the end for giving feedback, but along the way as well. So all of these themes should pervade all of our instruction, home and school-based instruction, and that's where I'll tag in Anya to walk us through some very explicit strategies we can use at home and in school. So we'll transition over to that.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Is this all right? Thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to join you all today. I am a speech-language pathologist who also specializes in literacy instruction, and so I just wanted to provide some information about things you can do at home and resources that you can refer to for additional support, and also professionals that you can partner with to support your children. So I want to make a plug for speech-language pathologists because they have specialized training in language development as well as acquired language disorders. So they have a deep understanding of the progression of language development as well as changes in language that can occur in response to neurological changes. Now, all speech-language pathologists have this general training, but they do go on to specialize. And so SLPs who work in the school setting specialize in supporting spoken language development, while many of the SLPs who work in the medical setting will be a great resource post-surgery to talk about language changes that occurred in response to any neurological changes. So you may need a couple of SLPs on your team that can consult and collaborate and work with the school team to really provide the most appropriate assessment and recommendation to support language and literacy skill development. There are speech-language pathologists who also specialize in literacy development and instructions, but not all SLPs have this background. So again, there might be yet another third SLP you might want to consult and collaborate with who can help bridge spoken language to written language development. And all SLPs have a lot of experience collaborating with other professionals in the medical setting, with neurologists, neuropsychologists, psychologists, and in the school setting with physical therapists, occupational therapists, and neuropsychologists and special educators. So they're used to collaborating and working with other team members to really support a child holistically. I wanted to mention different language systems because you may see changes in any of these aspects. So oral language, there are different levels. There's phonology, a student's ability and awareness of sounds in words, and changes in the brain that can impact this level of language will translate to difficulties with speech and pronunciation, and possibly even translate to their ability to develop decoding and spelling skills because sounds are related to letters and how we represent those in writing. You might see difficulties with vocabulary retrieval, finding words that a child needs to express their idea clearly, or challenges learning new vocabulary, and changes in grammar, sentences, or their ability to engage in discourse, which is conversations or extended lengthy verbal output like giving an explanation or giving directions or explaining how to do a task. Or language use for social purposes. And so if you see changes in these areas, speech-language pathologists are the go-to person to support these. And it's important to know that this can affect a child's ability to understand language as well as their ability to express themselves, which then translates into difficulties with reading or writing. So the ability to understand spoken language will likely impact their ability to read and understand what they've read because it's all your ability to take in information and process it. And any difficulties with expressing orally, weaknesses in vocabulary or grammar, will likely also translate to weaknesses in written expression as well. So I mention all of this because although this is a talk about reading, spoken language is really critical for laying a strong foundation for reading skills. And that's really helpful to know because the reading process is really complex. And so we don't really have the time to get into all of the details of how to support reading development, but I do want to stress that there are things we can do at home to support spoken language skills, which will lay a strong foundation for developing reading skills as well. So this is the reading house that shows many of the different skills that really need to be integrated to develop strong reading skills. So the blue side of the house are the spoken language skills that lay the foundation for reading, vocabulary, grammar, comprehension, and comprehension monitoring, kind of being able to track of when you think you might have missed something, making inferences in different type of text structures or language patterns. So examples are comparing or contrasting, or telling a sequence of steps how to do something, or cause and effect. Those are different language patterns that we see in spoken language and in reading. And then there are reading specific skills, of course, like phonological awareness, the ability to segment words into speech sounds. So cat, segmenting that into k, at, for example, which is important for then layering on phoneme graphing correspondence, learning letters that correspond to those sounds. And then working on decoding and reading fluency becomes increasingly important to support reading comprehension as well. So I wanted to talk about ways that we can support vocabulary at home. There are three main ways that we learn vocabulary, incidentally, through just hearing language around us and taking it in. Intentional, so this is how teachers often teach vocabulary. They will select specific words and teach the meaning and definition. Or by wide reading, which is just reading as much as possible, all different types of texts, and being exposed to a lot of different types of language, discipline-specific vocabulary, scientific words, historical words, technological words, so that they can have a breadth of vocabulary exposure. And so one way to support that at home is to read texts, many different texts on the same topic. So this can be with any ages. If your child is learning about the revolution, you can pick up books on the revolution and read many books at home about that same topic. And reading many different books on the same topic, they'll hear the same vocabulary over and over and over again, and that exposure will help support their vocabulary development. To support academic vocabulary, one tool we can use is a vocabulary map. So this just helps students develop a deep understanding of vocabulary by learning different features of the word. So finding a student-friendly definition for the word, maybe finding a picture or a photo that captures the essence and meaning of that word, adding that word, examples of that word used in a sentence, and sharing synonyms and antonyms. And so here's an example for the word state, as in the physical condition of matter. And one resource I wanted to share with you is a dictionary that you can find freely available online, wordsmith.net. I particularly like this dictionary because it has leveled definitions. So there's a beginner dictionary, advanced, and intermediate and advanced. And so I like to use the beginner dictionary because it has the most simple, student-friendly, accessible definitions of words. There are often pictures available with words here too, and examples of the word in the sentence. For developing grammar and syntax, one thing that we can do at home is exposing students to audiobooks. So oftentimes this is a great accommodation while students are developing their reading skills. We can still continue to develop their complex syntax, grammar, and listening comprehension, which again will support reading comprehension skills. So Libby and Hoopla are often freely available resources through the library that you might want to check into, and you can borrow audiobooks and listen to them on a smartphone or other devices. And Audible, of course, is a paid service, but oftentimes is an accommodation for students through the school. There's also something called the Yoto player, which just has a couple of buttons and is very easy and student-friendly to use, with many different audiobook options.
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? The cause of the signal has been identified, and the Boston Fire Department has indicated it is safe to return to your rooms. For those persons in the stairwells, you may re-enter at the nearest floor and use the elevators. We regret any inconvenience this may have caused, and thank you for your cooperation. May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? The cause of the signal has been identified, and the Boston Fire Department has indicated it is safe to return to your rooms. For those persons in the stairwells, you may re-enter at the nearest floor and use the elevators. We regret any inconvenience this may have caused, and thank you for your cooperation.
Okay, let's go on. So as I mentioned before, there are different text structures or language patterns that we want to expose children to. So in conversation, it's a lot of kind of informal back and forth language. But in academic texts, there are very complex and complicated language organizational patterns. And so by exposing students to literature as well as nonfiction books, we can expose them to more different types of text structures. So nonfiction books often have a cause and effect pattern. There's reasons that lead to an event or some kind of outcome, or many times comparing and contrasting different types of information. But nonfiction books are excellent because they are an opportunity to build background knowledge so that students have more context for learning and adding new information to their knowledge fund. So one great way to build background knowledge is reading nonfiction texts, but you can also do that by continuing to provide various experiences like going to the museums, hands-on projects, watching and discussing documentaries to build opportunities to build background knowledge through various modes in addition to reading and writing. There's some research that shows for younger students or children who are developing language, having back and forth conversations is really critical for developing more complex language. And so early on in the recovery stages after surgery, this is a great strategy to consider as well, making sure to engage in back and forth conversations. And the more turns you take, the more changes we see in brain development. I do want to just make the caveat that we have to be very mindful that children do become fatigued, and too much language can also cause that fatigue. So we want to be mindful of and monitoring when do they need a break from just listening and talking, and be an advocate for them for that too. So I wasn't sure if we'd have enough time to talk about some other strategies, so I do want to just get to this final point, and then we'll have some time to answer any questions. Students who are in the process of regaining and developing language skills and reading skills may need accommodations in the meantime to access their school assignments. And so some general accommodations I'll go over in a second, but I do just want to stress that the assessment will really drive the student's individual education plan. And so it's really important to have evaluations and reevaluations as students are making progress, to have very specialized and tailored accommodations to that specific profile. And so some accommodations that might be helpful are reducing the workload, so modifying assignments to reduce the amount of work, but without compromising learning objectives. So maybe instead of doing 20 problems, they can just do 5, but show that they understand the concept. And this will help with fatigue as well. Frequent breaks, scheduling regular breaks to help students manage their fatigue and maintain focus, allowing movement breaks, and making sure to provide extended time for completing assignments and tests, but also in between classes to make sure they have a time to kind of recharge and get to their next location or activity. Providing alternative assessment methods, allowing oral presentation or projects or visual representations as alternative to written tests, being allowed to use open book or take-home tests to reduce time pressure, providing modified test formats, breaking tests into shorter sections that they can take over several different sessions, use more simplified language, and providing checklists or schedules for students to manage multi-step projects. For weak listening comprehension, using clear, concise language and providing written instructions along with visuals to supplement any oral or listening demands. And for also for supporting listening comprehension, pre-teaching vocabulary before starting a new lesson or topic, reviewing new vocabulary often, frequent checks for understanding, and frequent repetition and review of concepts. And to support expressive language, making sure to provide extra extended time for students to formulate their thoughts, avoid rushing or interrupting them, providing alternative communication methods, such as a communication device, and scaffolding responses with sentence starters or fill-in-the-blank activities. So these are some resources that are available specific to parents. ASHA is the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association, and there are resources about language development and how to access providers. And Reading Rockets and Dyslexia has specific handouts and information on how to teach reading and to provide appropriate accommodations. So I'll pause there and I'll open it up to questions, and Joanna will come join me here. So if you have a hand, if you could just, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and there's a microphone that will come around just so everybody can hear your question. Thank you.
Unfortunately, you're going to have to project because the microphone is really just for the recording. It's not going to go through the amplifier, but we'll restate if needed. So just project.
Okay. So for kids who've had hemispherectomies, have you found any specific reading curricula that has been successful in teaching our kids on how to read? So I have a 14-year-old who has been stuck at a second grade reading level for at least 4 years and just cannot get over that hurdle. Have you found anything?
So the question is, can we finally have an answer to what to do to teach kids to read post-hemispherectomy? I have not been part of that research, but I would love to do it. Sometimes the challenge in doing work that involves reading instruction is the price tag. So intervention research is among the most expensive because it's long duration, and that's been part of our roadblock, which is it's a small price to pay for the payoff. What we usually do is fall back on the principles from the dyslexia world, which helps some, but it's not exactly right. At a previous conference, there was a researcher, Jill Allure. Jill Allure has developed reading intervention for students with vulnerable intellect, which includes some of this community in part, and I have found the principles that she has had in her intervention program may be really helpful for many of the families looking for specific curricula. If you look up her name, it's Allor as her last name, and her resources and publications and the curriculum and the website for it are all really available, but also come find me if that's not. I usually have a list of recommendations that follow in her work. I also look toward the work that's been done with students who have Down syndrome, or there's just pockets of communities besides developmental disabilities like dyslexia that try to address this. And so what we're doing is just trying to pull from all the other communities that have tried to answer it and see what helps this community. So I'd love to keep talking because I think my follow-up questions for you would be, what have they tried? How long have they been trying it? Have they changed? What's the experience been like? What's the experience in and out of school settings? I know that for everyone, that's a story that's complicated and tough.
Joanna, can you touch on some of what we talked about yesterday at our scientific meeting about the impacts of vision and auditory challenges? Because I get asked that question a lot. What is the reading? Teachers ask me because I do free school training for any child who's had epilepsy surgery, and I'll do it once a year, and it's free. So if you haven't signed up for that, I would happy to do it. But the teacher always asks me this. The parent always says, what is the curriculum? And my answer is always, are you accommodating for the child's, and do you fully understand all of the visual impairments that come after hemispherectomy, which is not more than hemianopia, and all of the auditory processing challenges. If you can't hear the sounds you're speaking, it's going to impact your ability to access spoken language, to read, all of that, which you guys can articulate much better. But can you just like weave that into what we're talking about? Because I think it's really hard to talk about reading in isolation, which is why we're trying to have a more holistic view of these kids, right?
So following on the brilliant thing that Audrey just shared, I'll just build on that to say the answer will never be this curriculum is the answer. Instead, they're all just tools and they're as good as our utility of them. So in this context, there's a lot of nuance per person, although overall there could be some generalizations for auditory and visual challenges. At the very baseline, just the visibility of text and how it's presented and the fatigue level and how children are taught to scan and what their visual field is like and who the person teaching them, what their understanding is of the complexity of their visual experience. Second, the other baseline is the auditory system. So if your capacity to perceive speech sounds, remember them, engage with them, manipulate them, play around with speech sounds is compromised, that is a challenge for then being able to take a speech system that isn't precise and map it onto print. So the essence of reading is taking the symbols that we use with our speech, the sounds we make, which are symbols, and map them to the symbols that we have on a page. So sound to symbol. If there's some complexity with our perception or processing or access of sounds in language, that will be a barrier to then the mapping. So when we think about word instruction, there are modifications that might be important to make to any curriculum that are going to be making these vulnerabilities not stand in the way, but taken into account. What I'm sharing now is a bit generic, but that's maybe the best there is so far, which is not enough. I almost feel like I have to apologize on behalf of the research community for just not having the answer or something to just really help right this minute. But like I said, talking offline and just one-on-ones, if that could be in any way supportive, we're very glad to do that. Who can top that question? That's a couple more.
We start here and then there. What project?
Hi, I was wondering if you could speak to the more non-speaking high-tech AAC realm and what resources and recommendations you have for that. My daughter's 3 years old, uses high-tech AAC, very intelligent, but doesn't have full spoken language. And I'm a reading specialist and was never taught anything about it and would love to hear any resources or recommendations.
I think that microphone is picking it up. So the question was around how to support AAC users with literacy development. So that's not my area of specialty, but there are some groups that are exploring options. And if you would like to email us, I can send you some resources and more information about the groups that are working on that.
I get a question here.
Hi. My daughter had a significant decline in her reading ability pre-surgery, then post-surgery. And I guess, and one of the things you said is, and that was when she was 14. She's turning 17 this year. If that ability, not that it's like a magic, look into the magic globe, but have you seen cases like that? And if she had that capability, is it easier to recoup from that? Or I don't know quite what I'm asking, but she had the ability. Now we're trying to rebuild that. This is eye-opening for me to listen to everything that you're saying. And the other part is she had about 2 years, because we got caught in the middle of COVID before we got diagnosed and had significant seizures until we had surgery. So I had 2 questions: is if it's there, is it easier to kind of rebuild back? And number 2, when you said a shorter duration, is that like months, years? What does that shorter duration mean?
So I think the question is, how long does it take for a bounce back if you had language, if your system was intact before or those skills were available, that version of it? So I don't actually know. And one challenge is that it's very difficult to find a assessments that were done before and after, and then follow-up. So this actually could be a potential opportunity for a case study. If there's data available that we can start to accumulate across others who may have that available as well. Most kids that I'm aware of do not have reading as part of their pre-assessments before surgery. So it makes it very difficult to know where they started and where they were. But putting that aside, where we are today is where we are. And I would kind of think of that as the baseline. What the before was is a different chapter. So I don't know who could answer the question of will they be like they were before in the same way? I think now the question is, here we are, and where can we go? And if the pacing feels good, like if you feel like you're getting some movement forward, that's wonderful. If you feel like we're not getting anywhere and stabilized, maybe we can talk about what's been done and where that could be modified to be more appropriate.
When you say short, is that in between seizures and surgery? What was that?
Well, so the question is, when we described that a predictor of reading scores being higher was a shorter duration between, that was a correlation. So it's not a fixed number. It's just that if there tended to be less time across all the students that we tested, if it was shorter versus those who were longer, but it's relative. So there's not a specific number.
My question was, my son had a hemispherectomy. He's almost 2, just starting to talk. English is our second language. Both languages are important to us. Should we do one at a time or both, or how should we approach that?
You should definitely nurture both languages. That's best practice, is supporting as many languages that are spoken at home. Yeah.
And there's no evidence post-hemispherectomy that there, like with some of the language challenges, that would be any barrier to acquiring both languages or learning to read in both languages, for example?
There isn't any research in other populations to show that it's harmful in any way. In fact, it's beneficial. The research about bilingualism or multilingualism shows that they actually develop better critical thinking skills because they're better able to switch between different languages and in different settings, and can create a wider fund of vocabulary as well, because there's certain concepts that just can't be translated into other languages. Do you want to add anything?
And I'll just add a little bit to that. If you ever in the future have a language evaluation, you might want to make sure that the person doing the evaluation is competent in the second language, because then they can assess in that language as well. There are some assessments that are meant to be flexible for language type, so that you can really fully capture the full range of vocabulary or awareness of how your child is engaging in both languages.
Yeah, I was just wondering, our son Maxwell had a hemispherectomy. He's had three separate surgeries. We found after he started the Orton-Gillingham program, he learned how to read. That program was very helpful for him. I don't know if that's ever discussed or.
So it's great to hear that for your son. There's a specific approach to teaching called Orton-Gillingham. The name is after 2 individuals who were who moved it forward. OG for short, you might hear a lot about, especially in the context of the dyslexia world, and it's the go-to recommendation for supporting vulnerable readers how to read. So say that one more time. I shared some principles of good instruction for reading earlier. Programs and approaches like Orton-Gillingham are the go-to for answering those and checking off the boxes. So the only caveat around Orton-Gillingham is that it's not actually like a specific program. It's an approach for instruction. So that means you might see some variability in how people deliver it. But that is one of the top recommendations for how to teach reading to vulnerable readers. And just to kind of complete that, there are a couple other programs in the same family. So just to give you some names of those, if those are concrete. One of them is Wilson, another one is Lindamood Bell, and they're all named after the people who kind of moved them forward.
Hi, I apologize if this is somewhat going back to the first question, but I'm in the similar situation. My daughter is 17 and a half and is almost 16 and a half years post left side hemispherectomy. She has always learned to read very well. Going back to that house slide you had up there, all of those elements, like yep, does well on all of the individual elements. Has never been an avid reader. We've tried everything, and she just can't get up to that reading comprehension roof. And talking to other parents, I know that that's not unusual for challenged readers, and probably particularly in this community. I'm just wondering, like, you just keep plugging away at those elements, even though there seems to be mastery of individual elements, because now she's, very much into the reading to learn part of education. I mean, years ago, and is just stuck, and nobody really knows what else to do. So, just wondering if there's any tips.
I can answer a part of your question, then you can add on. So reading comprehension is the most complex skill because it requires the integration of all of those different rooms or elements. And working memory is really critical for that piece, because when we are reading, we have to hold on to many different details for an extended period of time and integrate or put together and synthesize all of those details to understand the big picture. And so with working memory weaknesses, or if you missed a word here or there, it's like missing a piece of the puzzle. And so you're missing critical details to really understand what you read. One way to support that is to use graphic organizers. So there are graphic organizers called thinking maps or brain frames. I particularly like those because it's just a set of 6 or 8 graphic organizers that capture those language patterns that we talked about, showing similarities and differences, comparing, contrasting, showing cause effect, details about one topic, or sequencing or a flow chart for steps or a story. And that way you can capture the big idea on paper and hold it still for her, so she doesn't have to hold on to it and keep track of it all at once. And that way you can, if she's reading a story, you can, at the end of each page, write down an important event that happened in the story, just one detail. Next page, one detail, and then have it recorded where she can review it or reference it, so that we're offloading everything she has to hold on to in memory onto a piece of paper that's easily accessible and a good reference for her. So that would be a really great strategy to try and support that more complex reading skill. Is that something that's been tried?
Yeah, the point about working memory is fascinating. It's so frustrating, and imagine it for many of the parents. She has amazing working memory of random other things, like song lyrics or Aaron Rodgers' birthday or whatever. Like, can't remember what she did. And so we try all the strategies at home, but then getting to a standard test, and basically coming back with a second grade result.
So those random facts are actually stored in long-term memory and might be harder wired. Working memory is your ability to hold on to information in the moment. So like mental math, you have to hold on to the numbers while you're manipulating and solving a math problem. And the challenge is sometimes it doesn't transfer into long-term memory, which is why it seems like they have it one day and then they lose it the next day. So it's really important to consider accommodations. And so having notes that they can refer to, open book tests where they can use resources and references will be really helpful to just support them with the weakness that they have.
We're going to take one more question. We're a couple minutes over, but because of the alarm.
Can I smidge and add one more little
Go ahead,
caveat?
Matt, and then you can.
Your question about reading comprehension is the goal. It's the goal of reading. You want to be able to extract knowledge. Just to speak to that, our reading comprehension skill will be dictated by our word reading, by our language comprehension, and by our cognition. So if we want to understand a particular individual's challenges with reading comprehension, we need to kind of take stock of how all those other skills are, where they are as strengths and challenges, and then figure out how that combination is leading to the consequences in their reading performance. So I just want to speak to that. Reading comprehension is not just a skill, it's the combination of everything else in that house. And for everyone, there'll be different pieces that may or may not be available. And then For some kids, the integration part will be the hard part, not just having the skills in isolation, but putting them all together in real time. So I would just invite you to just maybe sit with us and do a deeper dive to think about the specifics for reading comprehension, and what we could brainstorm together. Sorry to distract you.
Are there any, I don't know, exercises or activities that can be used? Oh, are there any activities or exercises that you can have children do to improve their working memory?
Exercises or activities to improve working memory.
Okay, this is the other million-dollar question. Can you improve working memory? Okay, let's see. The most efficient answer is not really. To my knowledge, you can play games like that card game where you put cards down, you remember which one it is. That might get you better at that particular game, but those skills don't tend to transfer. So to my knowledge, in the literature is available on the research end, on average, changing working memory outside of just getting older, development, working memory isn't easy to change through instruction or practice. So a lot of times if you think that is a barrier, then that means moving and shifting to a model of how do we change the environment if we can't change the person to help this outcome not be a limiting factor.